All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us, and thanks very much for your time. My name's Andrew Schaefer from Trafalgar. I'm logging in from Trafalgar's Johannesburg branch in Birdhaven near Melrose Arch. I'd like to welcome our fellow panelists today, and a particular welcome to Frederick Nell, who's the founder and CEO of Curasure, which is a maintenance specialist and widely involved in preparing tenure maintenance plans for sectional title schemes. So Frederick will talk to us shortly about the process and the recommendations around preparing tenure plans and work through a practical example. Also joining me is Sean Swindon, who's an operations manager with Trafalgar in Johannesburg, Helene Thompson, our sectional title manager in our Pretoria branch. So welcome and thank you very much, everybody. Just to mention that the invitations that you receive do have the YouTube links for all the prior webinars that we've offered and the recordings of those. So I think this is our 5th webinar. And if you look back at the invitations, there will be a list of the other topics that we've covered, plus those links. And if any of you would like the presentation slides, you're welcome to get in touch with me and I can gladly email those out. So my contact details together with my colleagues are on the last slide of this particular presentation. So please bear that in mind. Our last webinar for the year will be held on the 26th of November at 4 o'clock, Thursday the 26th. We will send out invitations and a registration link for that in due course as per normal. The topic for that one will be the roles and responsibilities of sectional title trustees, which I think is another interesting and important topic. We focus on sectional title particularly because it's difficult to generalize for directors of homeowners associations because those roles and responsibilities do change based on the form of the homeowners association and their particular memorandum of incorporation, their MOIs. But what we are excited to launch next year is that we will be doing or offering induction training for new directors, which will then be specific to that estate's MOI and any other applicable documentation and legislation. And that will be a very nice training and activation session for new boards of directors. So we're excited to offer that, and we're working on a pilot case as we speak, which is largely complete. We will then take a recess over December and January and resume again in February. So there'll be 2 months break over the holiday season, and we'll commence with monthly webinars from there, which will be good. Just to let you know as well that we have completed a 9-module sectional title caretaker training course in webinar format, which was completed over 9 weeks. We had approximately 150 caretakers around the country. I think it was well received based on the feedback we obtained. We're busy preparing Trafalgar certificates to confirm the training and the completion, and we'll now offer those modules free of charge on an e-learning training platform. So if any of you have new caretakers or anyone else that would be interested to complete an introductory sectional title course targeted at caretakers or building managers, we would be glad to offer that to them. And my colleague Karine Kutsia, whose details are on the last slide, will gladly assist with enrollment and supporting that particular course. So as you can see, we are building training content, delivering it through a webinar or an e-learning platform. It's linked onto our website. It's absolutely free of charge. The point is to promote sectional title knowledge and awareness and to answer questions and to really engage with our clients in the industry in that way. So thank you very much indeed. I'm now going to hand over to Helene, who's going to talk us through the legislation that's applicable to maintenance and the maintenance expectations in sectional title schemes specifically. So Helene, thank you very much. And if I can just invite any questions, you're very welcome to pose your questions on the Q&A. I'll type answers where I can, and I'll direct the questions to my panelists as and when a gap arises. So please keep them coming. And Helene, there we go. If you could make a start. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Andrew, if I can ask you just to move over to the next slide for me so long. So in terms of sectional title, it is very important when you address a maintenance item or a complaint, you first need to ascertain whether the maintenance is the responsibility of the body corporate or the responsibility of the owner of the section. So in this picture, you can see that the green area indicates the section. Any maintenance in this area, of course, is the responsibility of the owner of that section, whereas the red indicates the common property, which is the responsibility of the body corporate. One main exception to note here is the geyser or any water heating device, regardless of where it's situated. That remains the responsibility of the owner of the section. And it's also important to bear in mind that the legislation refers to a water heating installation, not just the geyser itself. So this means that it also includes hot water pipes and other items that might form part of that specific installation. If we can move over to the next slide, Andrew. So every sectional title has two different categories of maintenance. Namely, we have your planned maintenance, which is catered for in terms of your reserve fund. And under planned maintenance, of course, we have any 10-year plan maintenance as well as any proactive maintenance. Then we also have your ad hoc or your unplanned maintenance. This would usually include your emergency repairs, day-to-day minor maintenance items, reactive maintenance items, and those items are all usually covered and funded by your admin fund. We can move over to the next slide. All right, so when we define who's responsible for maintenance to be done in different areas, sometimes it becomes a little bit more tricky than just saying it's inside your flat or it's inside your unit. Then it's not always in black and white. So in this instance, we need to first check. So in terms of this case study, this unit has a balcony. So the first thing we need to check, and if you can move over to the next slide for me, Andrew, please.
Coming up.
No problem, thank you. So in this scenario, the balcony forms part of the section. This means that the owner is then responsible for the maintenance to the balcony. Bearing in mind that between the balcony, the unit heading towards the balcony, there's going to be walls, doors, windows, whatever the case may be. In terms of this scenario, because of the fact that the balcony is part of the section, the walls, doors, or windows leading to the balcony is also the responsibility of that specific homeowner, that specific section. Can move over to the next slide for me, Andrew. Right, so in terms of this slide, your balcony is common property. So because of the fact that your median line runs between the unit and the balcony, that is the middle line, your balcony is common property, your unit belongs to the owner, and as a result, any wall, floor, or windows leading from the unit to the balcony would be a 50-50 split between the body corporate and the owner. We can move to the next slide. So then we have our last slide, which is scenario 3. In terms of the balcony, if the balcony is registered as an exclusive use area, it can be registered in one of two ways. So if the balcony is registered in terms of point 1, it's in terms of the plans. This means that the body corporate is responsible for the maintenance of that balcony, even though the owner has the exclusive use right registered. The body corporate remains responsible and they have to charge a exclusive use area levy for it. The second avenue that can be followed is if they register the balcony as an exclusive use area after the fact in terms of the rules. Then it states that either the rules will have to state who's responsible for the maintenance of that area, whether it be the owner, and if it is the owner, then an exclusive use levy will not be charged. Or if the rules don't say anything about the maintenance, then the body corporate remains responsible for that maintenance and have to charge the exclusive use levy. If we can move over. So in terms of case study 2, we often face complaints where damage is being caused either inside a unit or to common property, but it comes from an area that is not necessarily the party who is suffering the damages. So the responsibility to maintain, in this slide, you can see there are 4 sections. There's no common property between sections 1 and 2, 1 and 3, 2 and 4. As a result, if there is any damage or any cause of damage coming, let's say, for example, from unit 1 to unit 3, there's a leaking pipe. That responsibility is a matter between the two owners because there's no common property involved. In respect of resultant damages, bearing in mind, regardless of whose responsibility it is to fix the origin or the cause of the damage, a claim can still be put in against the body corporate policy for consideration for resulting damages. However, the insurance will not proceed with that claim unless there's proof of repairs to the cause of the damage. So just also important to note that contents inside the unit is not covered by the building insurance. Only your building and your fixtures would be included. Yeah. We can move over to the next slide. So then we just want to show you a little bit about the prescribed management rules. So in terms of your prescribed management rules and the requirement for a 10-year maintenance plan, the legislation is very specific of what has to be included, being the major capital items, what their current condition is, the time or the life cycle of those items, the estimated cost, anything else that the body corporate or the trustees feels relevant can be added to it. But there is those specific requirements, and if your plan does not adhere to those requirements, then it won't be found as compliant. If we can move over to the next slide, Andrew. All right, then what's very important is once you've got your 10-year plan, somehow now you need to fund it. And that's where your reserve levy comes in. So your annual contribution to the reserve fund, the legislation also goes further to state what the formula is that needs to be applied to be able to calculate your reserve fund. There is a minimum reserve fund levy, but here we're focusing more on the 10-year plan and catering your reserve fund levy to cover that 10-year plan. And we've seen it a lot in practice where people will approve a 10-year plan, but they're not funded correctly. So you cannot implement a plan unless you've provided for the correct amount to be able to cover those expenses. And then your 10-year plan has to be approved at every AGM. It becomes a rolling plan, so every year you will lose, your current year will fall off and you'll add another year, but it has to form a 10-year plan to be approved by the members. And then also at each AGM, the trustees have a requirement to report to the members what, in terms of the prior year's approved plan, have they implemented, and they have to provide that report to every AGM. It's not a nice to have. It's very, very important that they provide that to each and every AGM so that the progress on the 10-year plan can be monitored at all stages, and members are well aware of how it's being addressed and when things are being addressed. I think that's it from me, Andrew.
All right, thanks very much, Gillian. I'm going to ask you two questions which have come through because I think it just reinforces some of the principles that you've mentioned, and it just gives a common scenario which I think will be useful for everyone to hear. So here's the first from Maureen. They have exclusive use they've got exclusive use patios with built-in briars and chimneys. The question is, who would be responsible for painting and maintaining these briars and chimneys? And perhaps you can then just talk about, checking the rules, etc., and how you would go through the due diligence to work out that maintenance cost allocation and who would actually arrange the maintenance.
So in terms of that, the first thing that I would look at is your plans to make sure that it's not registered as exclusive use under the plans, or alternatively, your rules. Now remember, bearing in mind that it could be your conduct or your management rules. So we have to review both in order to see, firstly, where it's registered as exclusive use, and secondly, what your rules then provide in terms of the maintenance, insurance, and so forth. So in terms of your rules, if you are paying immediately, if there's an exclusive use levy being paid by that member, regardless of whether it's R1 or 50 Rand, there's an exclusive use levy being paid by that member for that exclusive use area. So the body corporate is then automatically liable for the repairs and the maintenance to that area. If there isn't an exclusive use levy, then the last item that you need to decide on is, and if it's under your rules, does the rules state that the member is liable? If the rules don't state that the member is liable, the body corporate remains liable.
Okay, jolly good. Thank you. Thank you for that, Hillian. Then another one, and this we see often as well. So a number of units have old steel windows requiring maintenance on the outside. A number of units have already replaced those old steel windows with aluminium windows. And they're now currently planning maintenance, etc. So could you just talk to how do you decide who repairs the outside of those steel windows? And if they're deemed irreparable, for example, how is the cost of aluminium windows allocated? And maybe you could just comment on the design of those aluminium windows to match the standard in the complex as well.
All right, so in terms of the windows, bearing in mind that the window is 50-50 because it's common property outside and it's a part of the section on the inside. So if it's just maintaining the windows on the outside, it would be the body corporate's expense, flat, straightforward. We've actually had exactly such an instance with one of our complexes in Pretoria during this past month, where the steel windows are also creating a problem, and the members want to replace them with aluminium. And unfortunately, in terms of the new legislation, or the new STSMA, in terms of the replacement of it, unless it's specifically required, or unless we can say it's a necessary replacement, the approval to replace it becomes a bit tricky. So what we have done there is we've tried to change the type of resolution that you need from a unanimous or all consent down to a ordinary resolution by converting the window frames to exclusive use areas. Now internally and externally. But in our case, so in that instance, we'll be able to make it going forward that the window frames are exclusive. But in terms of actually replacing it, there's a very fine line between whether it's seen as a what would be under the old regulations as a luxurious or a non-luxurious improvement to common property, because it doesn't only affect the inside of the unit.
Okay. And lots of questions coming through, and I think the key point is that before maintenance is planned or required or undertaken, it's critical to understand who's responsible for that maintenance and who's responsible for the cost. And a lot of what we're talking about now is exactly that, determining, is it part of a section, is it common property, or is it part of the exclusive use? And that due diligence then helps answer those questions of planning and cost responsibility. Hillian, just another one, I think, before we move on, balustrades on a balcony. Yes. Also a common feature. So in this particular case, the balustrades on the balcony is part of the section. Please assist in terms of maintenance and cost the outside of the balustrade.
So in terms of that, if you're looking at the first case study we showed with the balcony being part of the section, because of the fact that your median line no longer runs between the unit and the balcony, your median line now runs at the end of the balcony area. So that area becomes 50-50 because that is now the exterior part of your section. So I would say if the balustrade is there, which it should be, it would be a 50-50 cost.
Okay. And a good idea then just to really clarify this point at the AGM or via a circular, and to reinforce it often so that everyone understands, and that as it's planned in the maintenance plan, it's clearly defined up front. And as Cillian says, there we've got it, the balcony part of the section, but the outer 50% of that balustrade would be common property, and therefore the body corporate responsibility to maintain. All right, jolly good. So thanks very much for that. Frederick, I'm now going to hand over to you if you don't mind, and we'll work through your slides over here.
100%. Thank you very much for the opportunity, Andrew, to spend a bit of time with you and your trustees. So today we're just going to run through a very basic rundown and a practical guide of how to put a 10-year plan report together for your AGM. And hopefully at the end we can answer some questions. So thank you for the opportunity. So we're going to start off the practical guide. If we can move to the next slide. So what is required in law for our 10-year maintenance plan? Well, what is required is to establish a maintenance reserve fund, to have a separate bank account, a separate set of accounts. It must be a written maintenance repair and replacement report, and there is annual and minimum contributions. So we're going to return or circle back to the minimum and annual contributions, but it's important for the trustees to understand that there's definitely two contributions that we need to make, and each of the above together must be submitted at each AGM, and it must be done for each consecutive AGM after that. So who is tasked with the responsibility? So the trustees is tasked with this responsibility. The trustees are, of course, entrusted, and they must exercise the body corporate powers and functions, and that's assigned to them. So the law is very clear, it is a trustee's responsibility. However, if the trustees are not necessarily maintenance experts, and the Sectional Title Act also makes provision for the trustees to employ professionals or specialists to help them in this function. So I'm just going to quickly touch base on the two funds. The first one is the administrative fund. So although the administrative fund is used for the operating expenses of the body corporate, I want to start off by looking at this one first, because we must recognize that there's also maintenance components in the administrative budget. So our day-to-day plumbing, electrical, so our reactive maintenance. As we've budgeted in the past in our administrative fund for plumbing or electrical expenses, for garden maintenance or pool maintenance, we can continue to do that. So there's a measure of uncertainty and reactive nature to this maintenance, and this maintenance we will keep in the administrative fund. The next fund I want to talk to, if we can move to the next slide, Andrew, is the Maintenance Reserve Fund. So this fund is the topic of our discussion today, and this fund is primarily used for the maintenance of the common property. So we look at the common property as the structures or the building envelope of the body corporate. So this will include your roofs, your waterproofing, windows externally. So if you've got wooden or metal windows externally, as Leon has explained, the external envelope is the body corporate portion. So painting, boundary wall, carport. So in somebody's corporate, this list can become quite comprehensive. So you've got body corporates who've got lifts or compactors or even gyms these days. So we need to separate those components. So what is the reserve fund used for? Well, the reserve fund, according to the law, must be used for the implementation for the maintenance, repair, and replacement plan. In other words, our reserve fund, or our cash or capital sitting in that fund, is ring-fenced. The law is very clear that we must use these funds to maintain the common property. We can move to the next slide, Andrew.
Sorry, I'm just answering questions as we go there. There we go.
No worries. So what must be included in our 10-year maintenance plan? First important factor to consider, it must be a written report, something that we can share with the owners and submit at each AGM. We must have a list of items requiring maintenance, repairs, or replacement for the body corporate. And I often tell trustees and portfolio managers that we've got to try and have a logical breakdown and group items together when we list these items, and try and keep it basic and simple. The next thing is we must have the current condition. So what is the current condition? The first year in which we want to maintain these items. So let's say we want to paint in 2021, that'll be the first year. The estimated cost of the maintenance per item listed on the 10-year maintenance plan, and then the projected life of that maintenance. So if I paint the building in 2021, how long will it last before I've got to paint again? So if I project 7 years, then I will have the next cycle at 7 years, and then any other relevant information. So this is an important thing to remember. So if we go to the AGM and we are aware of information relating to maintenance, it's important to note it down for the owners. And all of the above must be presented at each AGM in a written report. So let me try and break that down for you in very simplistic terms. So you'll see that what we've done here is we've listed the components or items. So we've got tile roofs, gutters, exterior walls painted, windows, carport. This is a very basic list, but you can see that we try and simplify it by keeping the items together. You'll see, for example, metalwork, woodwork, and general maintenance like that we can group together. That's the first step. Once we've listed the items, we will then merely list the condition rating. And here I encourage the industry to keep it simple and fairly short and sweet. So what yardstick do we use for condition rating? We can get very sophisticated, but we normally say if something can be maintained, it's in a fair condition. If it's brand new, it's good. And if it needs to be replaced, it's poor. So once we've got that noted down, we can also then note down the first year in which the item needs to be maintained and the frequency of that. So Andrew, if we could maybe skip ahead 1 or 2 slides, and then we can go straight to the condition rate, the current estimate. So you'll see each slide now just add some information right up to the point where we list the current estimate, and then that information is then merely just projected over a 10-year period. Nice and simple, straightforward. We also encourage maintenance plans not to have necessarily escalations and accruals in. I believe that accruals is part of a financial plan and not a maintenance plan. And we don't have we don't have a crystal ball. So it's simply impossible for us to predict what the escalations will be over the next 10 years for some of these items. So we suggest you keep it simple in the maintenance plan. We can add escalations in the financial planning. So next slide, please, Andrew. In essence, what we're recommending is a very basic conservative starting point. So if you want to start your body corporate on the road to good maintenance planning, start with a plan like that. From that point forward, we can grow that plan with information in more detail. So next step is for the funding is we can determine the PQ schedule. So once we've determined the reserve fund levy, we use the normal PQ schedule and we can calculate that out for the next financial year. On the next slide, you'll see we can even project that over a 10-year period. So if you've got investors buying into your property, we can include that in the pack as well. So then I just want to return quickly to the minimum amounts for the reserve fund, and then in our case study, we'll look at the annual contribution. There's sometimes a little bit of confusion or uncertainty around the minimum fund. The way I want to try and explain it to you today is there's 2 numbers that's important that we've got to first determine. The first number is what was the total income in our administrative fund on the previous financial year, or the levies in the previous financial year. So that, let's say we had our levies in the previous financial year was 100,000 rand. The second number that's of importance is what is the cash or value sitting in our reserve fund at the end of the previous financial year. There's a rand value. So for this example, hypothetically, let's say there was 15,000 rand in the bank account and 100,000 rand was the previous levy. So that 15,000 rand is just presented as a percentage of the 100,000 rand. So if you look at the example in A, for example, it says if the amount of money in the reserve fund is less than 25% of the total contribution administrative fund, you've got to contribute 15% of your budgeted contribution to the administrative fund. The next tier is if the value of the reserve fund is more than 100% of the contribution. So let's say I had 115,000 rand in my reserve fund, then there's no contribution to the minimum fund, minimum contribution. And the third scenario is, of course, the one that's left, and that is if the value in the reserve fund is between 25 and 100% of my administrative fund, then my contribution will be the amount that I've budgeted for maintenance in the administrative fund. So in the next slide, let me try and explain that with a picture, and you'll see if we can move to the next slide. You'll see on the left-hand side there's a bar that says 100,000 rand. So that 100,000 rand represents our total income and levies in the administrative fund in the previous financial year. To the right-hand side, you'll see 3 bars, one at 20,000, one at 115, and one at 30,000 rand. So if I've got 20,000 rand sitting in my reserve fund in the first scenario, I will have to contribute 15% of my administrative budget for the next financial year. On the 115, there's no minimum contribution. And on the 30,000 rand, where I'm above the 25% threshold, all I've got to do is contribute the amount budgeted for in my administrative budget going forward. So that's just to give you a little bit of an idea visually of how it looks. Then finally, I can close off before we look at our case study by saying, I would encourage you to keep it simple, sweet, and manageable. Get a plan on the table that you can work on and grow. Remember that maintaining the common property is a duty, it's a must. We as trustees must maintain it and report back to our owner. we can review it each year. So it is good that we can renew it. So the emphasis is not necessarily on getting it perfect year one, but rather to get a plan on the table and to work with all our partners to get it better. Very important, we must start recording maintenance projects and must improve our record keeping. So when we plan for the future, ideally speaking, we want to be in a position where we can look backwards and say, what did we do in the last 5 or 10 years? Because that can become a predictor. We can look at what happened in the past to guide us in going forward. Keep day-to-day in the administrative budget. Keep it simple. So plumbing, electrical, those reactive repairs, it can live in the administrative budget. Then grow the information as it becomes available. If you've got a lift, for example, and you're unsure when should this lift be replaced, at least put it on the plan and say, we don't know when. We suspect that it could be in year 10, but we're not sure, and the value we estimated to 750. So you don't have to overcomplicate it. You can add lines that says special projects to your plan, and then make use of experts because it will save you a lot of money in the long run. So, Andrew, with your permission, can we quickly have a look at the case study?
Sure. Just while I pull it up, Frederick, won't you just answer the important question coming up? You know, what happens if you don't have a 10-year maintenance plan? What are the risks? What are the comebacks? What are the, implications?
Well, the important thing there, Andrew, is to consider that it's the law, so you must have it. So it's very clear that it's the trustee's duty. So if you haven't done that, then you've broken the law. You haven't fulfilled the law. So the trustees, I think the laws also change in the way that the trustees are personally a bit more liable than what they were in the past. That onerous portion of the law is still resting on their shoulders. Your audited financial statements can be qualified, but I think the important thing is to recognize that that unit is your investment. So if you're not compliant with the law and you're not maintaining it and you're not doing your duties, then your asset value is going to get affected, potential buyers are going to get affected, and the management of your scheme is going to become very difficult. So I would encourage people to get a basic plan. That's why you'll see, Andrew, I'm saying keep it simple. Don't overcomplicate it. Make it simple enough that we can at least manage it. So let's look at the case study together. I want to ask you, Andrew, can we possibly start at the photographs today and just maybe start at the photographs? So just for the trustees' benefit, normally when we approach a maintenance plan, the first thing that we've got to do is we've got to go and do a thorough walk through the scheme. So in this case, you'll see we've got some photographs, and we can just take a guided tour through this building with Andrew, walk through the scheme and establish what is it that I've got to maintain. During this exercise, what we really want to do is start putting things in boxes. So I want to put the roof in one box, windows and doors in a box. So I want to start categorizing my maintenance in such a way that it makes sense. So lifts will be together with the compliance items, metalwork will be together. It's important so that we know if we want to plan, what does our building look like. So that's the first step. And we would if we do a plan, we normally take quite a bit of time just to go through and understand what the building looks like. If we could then go to the 10-year plan, if you don't mind, Andrew, right at the top, those items will then be presented per category over a 10-year plan, and you can see once again we've kept it very simple, straightforward with the current estimate. In our case, we're very fortunate because to get to the current estimate, we actually take that building and compare it to 10 other buildings where we've got a QS value on those items or projects or tenders, and we can actually work out very, very accurate prices. So there, maybe you want to look at your past projects or quotes that you've got currently for maintenance, you can use that. Keep it very straightforward, simple. On the next page, once we've got that maintenance plan projected, the next page is really our financial planning. And on this page, you'll see we've got an opening balance. There's a line item there for the minimum contribution. You'll see, I just explained to you how the minimum contribution works. Then there's a requirement from the plan. And then very important, that yellow line there is our annual contribution. So based on the information above, we're requiring 268,000 Rand for our current administrative budget as the contribution. You'll see that is well above our 15% requirement, so the minimum contribution doesn't come into play for the first year. And then once we've done this it'll carry over to the second year. And you can see we can actually start playing around with our financial planning and tailor making it to our needs. The important thing I want to leave you with is that the 10-year plan and financial planning is actually two different things. Once you've got the 10-year plan, you can start asking your portfolio manager to assist you with your financial planning. Then on the next page, we like to just show some of the financial information that's important at your AGM, and I believe it's a good idea to include your full replacement cost so we can just look at the maintenance values in relation to the actual property value and just record some of that. And there's a calculation for our minimum contribution. Then on the next page, you'll see for an AGM, what works very well is we also show the owners at the AGM visually what we're referring to as far as the values are concerned, which we think is a very valuable tool to have. So in closing, Andrew, simple, easy, most important thing is that let's get a 10-year plan on the table, and then the 10-year plan without implementation is worthless. So what we really need to start talking about is the implementation of that plan and managing that plan going forward.
All right, thank you very much, Frederick. I'll just turn to this typical view of a 10-year maintenance plan, which you talked about, and many trustees might have seen that. What we see as managing agents are many trustees get very stressed about uncertainty, and the uncertainty about extrapolating or planning when a particular item needs to be maintained or replaced or even upgraded. And that uncertainty almost creates a sense of, paralysis and not wanting to move forward. And there's a very well-known saying, some of you might have heard it, that it's better done than perfect. Better done than perfect. And as you say, Frederick, keep it simple. Because it's being updated every year, this plan is not cast in stone. It's not a fixed commitment for 10 years. It's going to be revised on an annual basis. Assumptions made this year are checked and updated next year. So that does de-risk the plan to some extent. It does mean assumptions can be checked each and every year, updated each and every year. A good example is a lift. So if you speak to most of the lift manufacturers, they will tell you the expected lifespan of a lift is 20 years. Now, all of you know, and if you think about a car, if a lift is looked after well, if it's serviced effectively every month, it's likely to have a much longer lifespan than 20 years. And we've got many lifts in our portfolio that are 40, 50, 60 years, even longer than 60 years, still working fine. So even if the lift is planned to upgrade in 20 years, and you wouldn't have it on a 10-year plan necessarily, but let's say you're getting to that time frame and on your plan, one would just move it out year by year by year, testing whether the lift is still working to meet expectations and it's operating safely. So that's a good example of, not to get worried about the uncertainty. Use the information that's available. A lot of generic assumptions are taken in terms of, when painting is required, when maintenance on waterproofing is required, etc. But each and every year with updating the plan, a site survey would be done and the conditions of those different components would be checked. And based on that, the assumptions and plan timing would be then updated. And so the plan rolls, as Hillian said earlier. Then, Frederick, you did mention these are all priced in current rand values. So each year when it's updated, the current rand values are used. Obviously, an annual escalation is built into the next year update, and at least then one understands what we're talking about in terms of the costs. We're not building in assumptions of inflation or otherwise in the years going out in the plan. That's correct.
Yeah, that's correct. So Andrew, I really try and stay practical there. On this example, for example, we're projecting is at a 1.4 million rand roughly over 10 years. So if you build escalation into this, you're going to change 1.4 into 1.6, but it still doesn't matter. I mean, if I tell an owner now it's 1.4, 1.6 over 10 years, the only thing we're really interested with is 2021. Is that figure accurate? Because if that figure is accurate at the next AGM, I'm going to update all of these figures and I'm going to look at a new figure. And that is the most accurate way to, on an annual basis, look at data that's up to date. So I can't agree with you more, Andrew. There's that saying, paralysis by analysis. We can overanalyze something to a point where we don't have a plan and we don't implement a plan. The legislator gave us a tool to help us manage and implement maintenance, not to stop doing maintenance because we're analyzing everything.
Yeah. Frederick, do you want to just quickly comment just about updating the plan? So what you would do as Curisure to update a maintenance plan that you're managing, and maybe just talk about some cost estimates of what it costs to get a plan like this in place, and also comment on linking this 10-year maintenance plan to the insurance replacement valuation survey, also a legal requirement to do every 3 years for a sectional title building.
Sure. So Andrew, for us, I know that the trustees are highly paid individuals with lots of time on their hand that can walk on water. That's why the legislators said that they must do it. But for us as professionals that do this for a living every day, we spend a huge amount of time in our plans is looking at the scheme visually and then getting the current estimate right. So we compare each building to other buildings where we've got data on file that's accurate to get to those estimates. Then on an annual basis, when we do the updates, so the first plan, we believe a lot of effort should go into getting those figures correct. And often, most of the time, I should say, we use a quantity surveyor to check those figures with us. So for an update, what we do is we physically go back to the building. We believe that you must visually go and inspect we can't sit in the office and guess what's happening on your site. For updates, we believe we've got to go back, look at your building, what has changed, if we can get information from the trustees or managing agents that's favorable. And then we go through that whole process again. But in our case, we do give a discount for that. So typically, we would look anything from about 3,500 to 5,000 rand for your small to medium sized body corporate, and then for your bigger body corporate, you've probably got to look between 5,000 and 10,000 rand for us to do the plan. And then we've also recently, because we've received a lot of requests, have initiated insurance valuations. So in our case, we do that through our Curisure and Engineered Solutions division. And what we do there is we partner with professional qualified quantity surveyors. So when we do the insurance valuation, a quantity surveyor draws up the actual current costs for rebuilding your scheme, so the replacement cost. And we can do a combination of insurance value reports with our 10-year maintenance plan. And obviously, we try and keep the figures as favorable as possible. So that's a little bit about how we approach it. Does that answer your question, Andrew?
Yes, thanks. I've got two relevant questions here on these subjects, Frederick. The first is, you showed in your funding model, why is the minimum requirement shown as well as an actual value from the 10-year maintenance plan? So let me just go down a page, I think, to where that one there. So you've got there a minimum contribution plus a value from the maintenance plan, giving you a combined total.
Sure. All right. So in some cases, you can imagine each building is very unique and different, and we fall in love with each one of our buildings individually. So in some cases, if the building is looking in a reasonably good condition, right, and we don't have a lot of maintenance in the first couple of years, but our maintenance reserve fund is depleted, so it's actually very low, then our minimum contribution will come into play. So if our opening balance is only 50,000 rand in this scenario, right, we may have to have a minimum contribution that trumps our projected annual contribution. So that's why we've got both, because there's so many variables that come into play. If your building is aged and it's got quite a high maintenance requirement and you've got a low opening balance, and in all likelihood, you'll only work on the annual contribution, which is going to be much higher than your minimum contribution in any event. But in some cases, it's possible that the building is in such a good nick, it's brand new, and we've got a very low opening balance, then we will work on the minimum contribution. So in that case, the yellow line will actually just become the value of the minimum contribution. That makes sense, Andrew. So we'll have in year one, that 268 will be replaced by the 129. Does it make sense, Andrew?
Yes, thank you, Frederick. Just there's been a question about templates and equipping the trustees with templates to compile their own. So, we get many requests from especially smaller buildings where the trustees feel equipped and they've got the time to compile their own plan. That would be absolutely fine. We could certainly provide through your portfolio managers a template which looks something like what you're seeing in front of you. And, as Frederick said, these different components in terms of the condition rating, the maintenance cycle, the frequency of those cycles would be required as per the legislation. and then a forecast in terms of the timing and the cost of maintaining those different items. But Frederick, won't you just mention the online tool which you've made available, which allows trustees or other stakeholders to compile their own maintenance plan, and the cost of that, and I can potentially circulate that link to any interested attendees.
Sure. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, we also had some requests from some bodies corporate that said they want to do their own. So we actually developed a little platform for trustees to use, and the website is DIY 10-year maintenance plan.co.za. So if somebody goes there, they can actually they can go and prepare a report very similar to what you're looking at now, with photographs and comments in a trustees report. And I think the cost is fairly nominal, Andrew. I think it's 250 Rand, if I'm not mistaken, for you to activate the license, and then you can do one for yourself. So,
okay, so
it's a good tool for somebody to use.
It's DIY 10-year maintenance plan written out in full.co.za.
Correct, yes. And 10 is the numerical 10.
Okay. All right, good. So just nice to know. And there is that online tool at a nominal cost for any trustees or caretakers to compile their own plan, looking very much like what you see in front of you. Frederick, I've had a comment about a homeowners association and the relevance of a 10-year plan to them. So, I think the answer to that is that it's not a legal requirement for a homeowners association, because they're not covered by the Sectional Title Schemes Management Act, where this is prescribed with the prescribed management rules. But it's still good practice, isn't it, to map out maintenance over a longer period of time, meaning that it's scheduled, meaning that it can be project managed, and meaning that budgeting can be applied to it.
Yes, I would certainly agree. I believe any asset that you own, you should have a 10-year maintenance plan, and I'm talking about properties. So we've been advocating since the early 2000s that if you own a property, it's better to prepare a basic maintenance plan and to plan for your maintenance. If you buy a car, Andrew, these days, most cars that you buy, you've got a maintenance plan in the cubby of your car that you buy. So any property, I would advocate having a 10-year maintenance plan.
All right, just a few more questions, Frederick. What is a good estimate for annual maintenance in terms of a percentage of the building value?
That's a very good question, but very difficult to answer because the buildings differ so much in their design and age, and there's too many variables. So if we look at, if we engage with engineers, for example, we can say a road. Andrew, you would probably know that if we say 20% of the value of road infrastructure every 20 years, with engineers are just different that way. They could have said 10% over 10 years. It made it easier for us. But on road infrastructure, you can work on 10% over 10 years. But it really depends on your building. If it's got a lift-in, what type of structure is it? Concrete is different from metal work. So metal windows, for example, aluminium will be very different to maintain. So at the moment, there's no magic number. Best is to start looking at your building on an annual basis.
Okay. Thank you, Frederick. Won't you just talk about the combined insurance replacement survey and the 10-year maintenance plan, that it can be undertaken together, and there is a cost saving in terms of that synergy with a single site inspection?
Yes, yeah, for sure. So if you can find a provider that can do both for you, there's obviously a saving in that, and I think it's a good opportunity to have a check on your maintenance plan or on your insurance valuation. So in our instances, for example, if you use a QS to do that, every 3 years at least, you know that you're going to have a qualified professional quantity surveyor checking the numbers on your 10-year plan as well as your insurance valuation. So I think as a trustee, it would be advisable when your maintenance, your insurance valuation comes up, to at the same time have a professional also update your 10-year maintenance plan. It can then be the same professional or separate, but you can certainly make use of that saving wherever possible. And it's best to have this done by professionals, Andrew. I mean, trustees already have so much on their shoulders to carry that to work with the responsibility of owners, money and assets, to have that done every 3 years as a check and balance through a professional, I think is a good idea.
Frederick, interesting question here. How would you do a maintenance plan for a scheme that was developed in phases? So the first 25 units are 10 to 15 years old. The next group are 5 to 10 years old, and the next group are 2 to 5 years old. So there's a whole range of different ages and so on in the different phases.
Sure. So the way that we've gone about that, Andrew, is we actually then create groups in the 10-year plan. So we say, instead of saying roofs for phase 1, 2, and 3, we say phase 1, and then we break that down, roofs, walls, whatever. So we keep in phase 1 of our maintenance plan the structures that's 5 years old. And then we create the second section in the 10-year plan for the newer phases. So taking a phased approach in the maintenance plan makes sense for me then, because you're also only going to maintain those items in a phased approach. So blocks has only been handed over the last 6 months. It's not going to get painted now. So we only want to plan for painting maybe 4 or 5 years from now, and carrying that phases into your 10-year maintenance plan is the most logical way to do that.
Okay. I've got 2 questions on a similar theme, Frederick. So the one was, if there's a burst pipe, for example, and emergency maintenance is required related to that, can that be expensed to the reserve fund? So an unplanned emergency.
So in theory, the answer is yes. You'll see in our plan, we allow for a contingency for preliminaries and maintenance. So there is a contingency. I always recommend. We even include one that says minor maintenance and yearly maintenance to cover some of those small repairs, just to make a little bit of provision for FAT. So you can certainly do that from there. So if it's a sprinkler system, for example, that broke, or something that's reactive maintenance, you can then have the choice whether you're going to do it either your administrative or your reserve fund. But I would argue, Andrew, that if the item is listed on the reserve fund, so let's say it's roofs and something happens on the roofs, right? You want to fund that out of your reserve fund, and that's why there's a contingency and a bit of a buffer. And it's, we understand that there's unforeseen. So I don't think the legislator is going to be unreasonable. I mean, it's a living, breathing plan. So for sure, we can take the money out of the reserve fund.
And I mean, similarly, it can also be allocated to the admin fund, because that's where, you know, reactive or unplanned maintenance is allocated to. So I think as long as you know, it's noted and clearly defined how it was allocated, you know, that would be fine. And if extra budget's required outside of the admin fund to deal with an expensive unplanned item, that can be covered then from the reserve fund. You know, what we're seeing as well is that, you know, because there's a reserve fund and there is budget that's allocated and agreed, it makes sense that costs need to be allocated to it. So this does raise the whole question of correct allocation of your maintenance costs, so that it does reflect in the right place, and that your budget is, you know, applied correctly and then measured correctly. And, you know, that does require some attention from the maintenance trustee and the chairman, you know, together with the portfolio manager, to make sure it is being measured and recorded correctly and in line with the budgeted, you know, plans. All right.
Sure. And so sometimes Andrew, those unforeseen items is something that we need to stop and look at. So let's say there's an unforeseen when it comes to sprinkler systems or plumbing or electrical. What that unforeseen also tells us is we should have a deeper investigation into this. So why did that item break, or why was this emergency necessary? Was it weather related, or was it infrastructure related? Because that could point us to a maintenance item where we could say, but hang on a second, we need to return to this item and maybe do a bit more planning and future budget for bigger and more major repairs.
Okay, thank you. I'm just trying to diligently answer all the questions. Helene, can I refer one to you? The question is, a sprinkler system in a body corporate, who's responsible if these, you know, for the sprinkler pipes and the valve room? So I suppose it depends exactly where the problem arises, but if the sprinkler system, you know, goes inside the sections, you know, where will the responsibility begin and end in terms of repairs for that?
Hi, Andrew. So in terms of a sprinkler system, Within the section, it's very clear it's the owner's responsibility. Outside the section, if it's on common property, it's the body corporate's responsibility. But bearing in mind that if it is a communal system like that, and it's servicing, or the origin is servicing multiple units, and it has to go through a unit to get to another unit, then there's a gray area where the body corporate also carries some responsibility. So it's very specific. You have to see exactly where the problem has arisen, who's being serviced by that specific portion of the system, and then you can define the responsibility.
Okay, thank you. And one more question for you, Helene. I'll just read it out from Stephen. Where a balcony is owned by the owner of the section, so balcony part of the section, can the body corporate insist on waterproofing to be done to avoid damages downstairs? So to what extent can the body corporate impose and stipulate maintenance inside a section, specifically the balcony, because there is risk for sections and property downstairs?
So in terms of that, Andrew, the body corporate does have the right to request maintenance be done inside a unit that might affect a different unit at any time. The body corporate, however, unfortunately, there is a very fine line between how far the body corporate can go. If it's causing structural damage, then the body corporate actually has the option to also approach CSOS if they're not able to force the owner to attend to the repairs that need to be addressed. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, I think so. Right, we're running a bit short of time. I'm going to skim through this one, and then Sean, I'm going to come to you just to talk about recommended maintenance practices in a body corporate. So, I think at the next webinar, we're going to talk about roles and responsibilities of trustees, but very simply, it's really important that the trustees and the body corporate organize themselves effectively in terms of decision-making and responsibility for maintenance to happen conveniently and time efficiently, and that it's clear who's making the decisions. So it should be not a committee generalized type of function. We would recommend that a maintenance trustee is appointed, somebody who holds the maintenance portfolio, and that person would then become the custodian of decision-making and implementation in terms of the maintenance plan, quotes, etc., generally in consultation with the chairman. By all means, feedback can be provided to all the trustees, but it's very helpful for somebody to take the lead, to be in charge, to inspect the common property, and really to be aware of what's happening. As Frederick said at the outset, maintenance is really key in terms of the presentation of the common property, the enjoyment of the common property, lifestyles of the residents. It makes a significant first impression. It does therefore have an impact on the values and the asset appreciation for owners in a complex, and therefore it should be organized, it should be well managed, it should be governed correctly in terms of the legislation. And it's actually not that difficult to do, as you're hearing. And certainly getting a professional involved at the outset to set up a plan and a system and the forecasts is a really good idea if you think that the cost, estimate is 4,000 to 8,000, given the size, dependent on the size of the common property. So, that's what we would recommend, and we'll go into more detail on the next webinar. But just some key items to be aware of, to have well managed. Does differ slightly by building, and these are some of the items that the maintenance trustee would really need to take charge of and make sure is well in hand. So that's the fire equipment, making sure that it's inspected and serviced annually, a major service every 5 years, a maintenance register, a register of fire equipment on file, and certainly the insurers should be provided the compliance certificate each and every year. An electric fence compliance certificate for sectional title units, for sectional title schemes, that's required for transfers, so it should be on file. It is often requested by conveyancing attorneys. It doesn't expire, but a new one would be required where repairs are undertaken. And then in terms of lifts, an Annexure B inspection is required every 2 years. The lifts are inspected by a registered lift inspector. They need to be registered with the Department of Labor. If there are any inspection items which are really snags, those need to be addressed within 60 days. After they're addressed, the inspector will come back, check that they're corrected, and then issue a clear certificate. Again, that should be on file, it should be in the lift motor room, and it should also be provided to the insurers. The insurance valuation, I think we've talked about, and then just a real emphasis on swimming pools to make sure they are safe, to make sure that these safety features are correctly in place, that they're checked on a regular basis, that any issues are quickly dealt with, because there is risk. And it just shouldn't happen that there's risk of drowning, there's risk of harm to children or those who can't swim. And, you know, we've had some tragedies over the years, and it just should be managed well because it's that important. So, you know, the bylaws differ slightly by area, but you can see the key points there, which would be highly recommended to have in place. Right, Sean, I'm going to hand over to you to close for us, but just talk to these common daily maintenance items that should be checked, should be supervised and attended to, often by a caretaker or a building manager or a resident or a trustee, anybody that's willing to take a role and, you know, make sure these happen.
Yes, thank you, Andrew. Just to carry on, so a couple of the important things that people need to just keep an eye on within their sectional title. Now, with the 10-year maintenance plan, that would obviously be more planned maintenance. So the following items are more ad hoc, which will probably assist you in your planned maintenance and save you costs in the long run. And very simple things. For instance, gutters you find mostly on carports, and I'm talking about gutters in accessible areas. So anything above first floor, you don't need to get up there on a ladder because it's health and safety, but just to get up there, remove leaves, remove refuse, those kind of things. Drains, make sure that your stormwater drains are clear, make sure that pipes are not getting blocked with sand, debris, litter, those kind of things, something which is easily rectified and cleaned today. In a month or two's time, when the storms hit and the rainy season comes, it can cause flooding and, you know, cause blockages in your pipes. Municipal meters, clear. I would suggest, you know, these guys come around there, they've got a huge workload. Just clean up your municipal boxes where the guys come to read the meters. It's a nice thing for them to arrive and there's a clean box and they don't have to dig through sand to get to the meter. Daily common property inspections, which is vital of any caretaker. There's very small things that can be done which will help you in the long run in your 10-year maintenance plan, and it will take it out of that budget and you'll actually save money in the long run. Cleaning of light covers, I mean, that's just aesthetics and just gives an overall aesthetic appeal to the building. Going into a building where there's been 10 years of insects collecting in a light fitting is just not desirable. Leaking taps, it's simple to replace a washer here and there. It takes maybe 30 minutes to do it, and if you don't do it straight away, you could have 2-3 days, maybe a week, maybe a month of a leaking tap, which could have knock-on costs. Refuse removal, make sure that you know, refuse is removed from around the common property. Make sure that offenders who are dumping refuse or rubble are identified quickly, and if it can be, get them to remove it. But otherwise, you know, just keep a control over that, because it can get out of hand very quickly and have a very serious knock-on effect for the body corporate in getting that removed. Weeds, another simple item which can be sprayed with poison. Again, aesthetics. If somebody comes to site and you've got all these weeds going through the paving, it just doesn't look good. And people selling their units, people that are buying, they look at things like this. Bird droppings, you have a number of health risks. There's a lot of debate around this topic, but, you know, rather be safe than sorry. There's a lot of parasites and health risks associated, especially with young kids, as well as the elderly, when you allow, for instance, the feral pigeon problem that we have in Johannesburg, for that to accumulate. So I would suggest getting your caretaker, or whoever is on site, to clear that at least once a week. Electric fencing, to avoid your security company addressing continuous false alarms, I would suggest once a week, even if at the very least once every 2 weeks, take a walk around the site, have a look if all your vegetation has been trimmed from the fence itself, check if all your bobbins are in place, see if your wires are taut and are installed as they were intended to be. Not a lot of sites have the electric fence voltage meter, but it is a highly recommended from my side. I do inspections on a lot of sites, and I normally test the fence, and a lot of the times you find that the fence around the gate area is a lower voltage than the one around the perimeter. Most important on most sites are CCTV cameras. You should check your line of sights. Is there vegetation growing in front of them? Is the cameras working? Is it in focus? Is the timestamp on the cameras correct? Because all of those are important when it comes to an investigation. You might not need them on a daily basis, but should there be an issue or a crime that happens and there's an investigation which is required, it could hinder that investigation. Irrigation, check, are all your pop-up heads, are they leaking, are they spraying water correctly? Maybe put in find a mist to save some water. Make sure that they're not facing any building or structure, because that obviously can cause damp. Security gates, have a look, see if it needs to be lubed, or see if the rail is coming loose. Those gates open and close a lot during the day. Make sure that the steel rod at the bottom that it runs on is secure, because they can also have a knock-on effect on your paving and the concrete around that area. Intercoms, you'll probably get a lot of reports from owners directly to say, listen, my intercom's not working. So that's not something that you can check per se, but perhaps your security can just test them on once a month. DSTV aerials, ideally every site should have a communal dish, but a lot of sites don't. So owners need to be made aware that if they're going to install a DSTV dish, they should ask for permission, and then the area where it should be installed should be identified for them, because it can become a mess. Bathroom facilities for buildings, for staff, and your guys on staff need to be kept stocked in terms of toilet paper. I've seen a lot of sites where guys are using newspaper and other materials to clean themselves. And then also your disclaimer boards and indemnity boards, just to finish off, that's vital. I mean, there's a couple of sites that I've been to that don't even have indemnity boards, and that could have a legal implication on the trustees or board members if something should go wrong. Andrew, do I have any more time, or is that me?
Sean, I think that's it. We've already run 5 minutes over.
No problem.
So I've hopefully answered most of the questions that have come through. There were 50, but we are unfortunately out of time, but you'll see our contact details here. You're welcome to email any of us or call. We gladly answer any questions. If you'd like a copy of the presentation or the YouTube link, which will be available on Monday, you're welcome to email me on andrews@trafalgar.co.za. So thank you for your time. I hope you found the topic interesting. It was a bit time pressured, but it's obviously a vast subject. But hopefully we covered some of the important principles. We will touch on it again in the November webinar, and by all means, we can discuss the topic further based on your personal circumstances by email. So good afternoon to you all. Thank you again for attending, and we look forward to convening in November for the roles and responsibilities of sectional title trustees.
Thank you very much, Andrew.
Bye now.